The dusty corner of the Hartford Historical Society was filled with countless forgotten treasures, but none of them grabbed Dr. Sarah Mitchell's attention quite like the ornate wooden frame leaning against a filing cabinet. Inside was a sepia-toned wedding portrait from 1903 that seemed to depict a typical Victorian ceremony. A serious-looking groom, dressed in his best black suit, stood next to his bride, who was wearing an elaborate white gown with intricate lace details. Sarah, a photography historian who specialized in early American portraiture, had seen thousands of similar images. The formal poses, the stoic expressions, the careful arrangement of hands and fabric, everything about it seemed perfectly ordinary for the time. The bride's face had the expected serious expression that was common in photographs from that era, when long exposure times made smiling impractical. But something about it bothered Sarah as she lifted the frame closer to the window. The late afternoon Connecticut sun streamed through the glass, highlighting details that she hadn't been able to see in the dimly lit archive room. She adjusted her glasses and squinted at the image, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the bride's face. "Just another wedding portrait," she said to herself. But her fingers traced the edge of the frame as if drawn by an invisible force. On the back of the photograph was a small handwritten inscription, "Thomas and Elizabeth, June 15, 1903. Hartford." There was no surname, no photographer's mark, and no other identifying information. The couple seemed to be well off. The quality of their clothing and the professional look of the photograph suggested that they were from Hartford's growing middle class. As Sarah was about to set the portrait aside with dozens of others that were waiting to be catalogued, a beam of sunlight hit the glass at just the right angle for a moment. Something in the bride's expression caught her eye, something that shouldn't have been there. Something that went against everything she knew about early 20th century photography and social customs. Her heart started to race as she realized that this ordinary-looking portrait might be hiding an extraordinary secret. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she carried the portrait to her desk and placed it under the adjustable lamp that she used for detailed photograph analysis. She reached for a magnifying glass, a tool that had revealed countless hidden details in historical images over her 15-year career. The bride's face, which had seemed typically solemn from a distance, began to reveal something remarkable under magnification. Sarah blinked hard, thinking that her eyes were playing tricks on her. She adjusted the focus and leaned closer, her pulse quickening with each passing second. There, barely visible but unmistakably present, was something that should have been impossible in 1903. The bride was smiling, not the practiced, posed expression that came into fashion in later decades, but a genuine, subtle upturn of her lips that suggested barely contained joy or perhaps amusement. "That can't be right," Sarah whispered to the empty archive room. Photography during the Victorian era required subjects to hold still for several seconds because of the long exposure times. Smiling was not only impractical, but also considered improper for formal portraits, especially wedding photographs. Social conventions in Hartford in 1903 would have demanded the serious, dignified expression that was typical of the time. Sarah studied the technical aspects of the photograph. The clarity was exceptional, far better than most amateur photography of the time. The lighting was professionally arranged, suggesting an established photographer's studio. But here was this bride, clearly breaking every rule of proper portrait etiquette. She examined the groom's expression, which was stern and appropriate for the period. His posture was rigid and formal. Everything about him screamed conventional Victorian propriety. But Elizabeth seemed to be sharing a secret with the camera, or perhaps with someone just beyond the photographer's shoulder. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began researching Hartford wedding photographers from 1903, cross-referencing studio locations with the background elements that were visible in the portrait. The wallpaper pattern, the furniture placement, even the specific style of carpet beneath their feet might provide clues about where this impossible photograph had been taken. The mystery was growing with every detail she discovered. The next morning, Sarah was at Hartford's main library, surrounded by dusty volumes of city records and historical newspapers from 1903. She had barely slept. Her mind was racing with possibilities about the smiling bride. Professional curiosity had turned into a genuine obsession. The Hartford Courant's wedding announcements from June 1903 didn't have any listings for a Thomas and Elizabeth, who were married on the 15th. She expanded her search to surrounding towns, West Hartford, East Hartford, Bloomfield, but still couldn't find any matching records. It was as if this couple had never existed in any official capacity. "Excuse me." Sarah approached the librarian, Mrs. Peterson, who had worked at the Hartford Library for over 30 years. "I'm researching a couple from 1903, Thomas and Elizabeth. They were married on June 15th. Do you know of any other sources I might check?" Mrs. Peterson adjusted her reading glasses thoughtfully. "Have you tried the church records?" Many ceremonies weren't always reported in the newspapers, especially if they were smaller affairs. Trinity Episcopal keeps excellent records. The Catholic churches have archives dating back to the 1890s. Sarah spent the afternoon visiting churches throughout Hartford. At Trinity Episcopal, Reverend Williams led her to their basement archive, where leather-bound marriage registers sat in climate-controlled cases. "June 1903, he murmured, running his finger down the handwritten entries. "Here, June 13th, Thomas Martin and Elizabeth Hayes. June 20th, Thomas Richardson and Elizabeth Collins." But nothing on the 15th with just first names. "What about unusual circumstances?" Sarah asked. "Anything that might have required discretion or privacy?" Reverend Williams paused, considering her question carefully. There were occasionally marriages that weren't, shall we say, conventional. Perhaps a pregnant bride or couples from different social classes. Such ceremonies might have been conducted quietly, with minimal documentation. Sarah's pulse quickened. Could Elizabeth's mysterious smile be hiding a secret that required such discretion? As she walked back to her car in the late afternoon Connecticut sun, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something far more significant than a simple photographic anomaly. Back at the Historical Society, Sarah decided to examine every inch of the portrait and its frame with scientific precision. She carefully removed the photograph from its frame, hoping to find additional clues on the backing or hidden within the mounting materials. Her patience paid off. Tucked between the photograph and the cardboard backing was a small piece of folded paper that had yellowed with age. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing a brief note written in faded ink. "My dearest Thomas, by the time you read this, I will be far from Hartford. The photograph must tell the story. I cannot look for what others cannot see. Remember our signal. Forever yours, E." Sarah stared at the cryptic message, her mind racing with possibilities. Our signal? Was Elizabeth trying to communicate something through her expression that conventional Victorian society wouldn't allow her to say aloud? She examined the photograph again with fresh eyes, this time looking for other anomalies. Under high magnification, she noticed that Elizabeth's left hand was partially hidden by the folds of her wedding dress. Her fingers seemed to be positioned in an unusual way, not the typical formal placement that was expected in wedding portraits. Sarah photographed the hand position with her digital camera and began researching Victorian Sign Language and secret communication methods. Her search led her to fascinating discoveries about how women of the era sometimes communicated covertly through fan language, flower arrangements, and hand positions. In a 1902 etiquette book, she found a reference to finger telegraphs, discreet hand signals that were used by women to convey messages in social situations where direct communication was inappropriate. According to the guide, specific finger positions could indicate danger, affection, or urgent messages. Elizabeth's finger position matched one of the illustrations, a warning signal that meant help, or not what it appears to be. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the implications washing over her. This wasn't just an unusual wedding portrait. It was a desperate woman's attempt to leave evidence of something terrible. Elizabeth's smile wasn't joy or amusement. It was a brave mask that was covering fear, and her hidden hand signal was a cry for help that had gone unnoticed for over 120 years. Armed with Elizabeth's note and her newfound understanding of the photograph's hidden messages, Sarah expanded her investigation beyond marriage records to missing person reports and news articles from the summer of 1903. She combed through police records, hoping to find any mention of a woman named Elizabeth who had disappeared around the time of the photograph. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the Hartford Current Society pages from July 1903. Buried in a small column about summer social activities was a brief mention. The ladies of the Hartford Women's Auxiliary expressed concern for Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, who failed to attend the quarterly charity luncheon despite having confirmed her attendance. Elizabeth Hayes, one of the names that Reverend Williams had mentioned from Trinity Episcopal's marriage register. But that ceremony was recorded on June 13th, 2 days before the date inscribed on the portrait. Sarah rushed back to Trinity Episcopal, her heart pounding with anticipation. Reverend Williams retrieved the marriage register again, and this time Sarah studied the entry more carefully. The handwriting was different from the other entries, and the ink was slightly darker, as if it had been added later. Reverend Williams, is it possible that this entry was made after the fact, perhaps backdated? He examined the page closely, his expression growing concerned. It's possible. In 1903, there were occasionally marriages that needed to be regularized for legal purposes. If a couple had wed in a civil ceremony or under unusual circumstances, they might later register with the church to avoid social scandal. Sarah's investigation led her to the Hartford Police Department's historical files, which were housed in the basement of City Hall. Officer Martinez, a young policeman with an interest in local history, helped her navigate the maze of filing cabinets containing records from the early 1900s. Missing person reports from 1903, he muttered, pulling out a thick folder. We've got quite a few. Hartford was growing rapidly then. Lots of people coming and going. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted a report dated July 20th, 1903. Elizabeth Hayes, age 23, reported missing by her sister Margaret. Family reports unusual behavior in the weeks prior to disappearance. The missing person report included Margaret's address on Asylum Street. In what had been Hartford's most fashionable neighborhood in 1903, Sarah discovered that the original Victorian house still stood, now converted into apartments. The current owner, an elderly man named Robert, invited her in when she explained her historical research. The Hayes family, you say? Robert nodded thoughtfully. I've lived here 40 years. The previous owner mentioned finding some old papers in the attic when he renovated. Might still be up there. In the dusty attic, beneath layers of insulation that had been installed decades later, Sarah found a small wooden trunk. Inside were personal letters, photographs, and documents belonging to the Hayes family. Her hands trembled as she opened a diary with Margaret Hayes written on the cover in careful script. The entries from the summer of 1903 painted a disturbing picture. June 10th, 1903. Elizabeth has been acting strangely since she met that man, Thomas. She speaks little of him, only that they plan to marry. I have not been introduced, which is most unusual for my dear sister. June 16th, 1903. Elizabeth returned from her wedding ceremony changed. She smiles when she thinks no one is watching, but her eyes hold fear. She begs me not to ask questions about Thomas or their living arrangements. July 1st, 1903. I followed Elizabeth today and discovered that she has not been living with Thomas as she claimed. Instead, she rents a small room above Mrs. Patterson's bakery on Main Street. When I confronted her, she broke down and confessed that the marriage was arranged to help her escape some terrible situation. She would not explain further. July 14th, 1903. Elizabeth came to me tonight in great distress. She said that she spoke of leaving Hartford immediately and asked me to keep a photograph that she said would explain everything if something happened to her. I begged her to go to the police, but she said they would not believe her. July 21st, 1903. My sister has vanished. I have reported her missing, but the police seem disinterested. They suggest that she may have simply left with her husband, despite my insistence that Thomas is equally missing and that their marriage was unusual from the beginning. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the diary. Elizabeth's smile in the wedding portrait wasn't capturing joy. It was the brave face of a woman who was documenting evidence of danger, knowing that it might be the last record of her existence. Margaret's diary provided crucial clues about Thomas, but Sarah needed more concrete information about the mysterious groom. She returned to the 1903 Hartford City Directory, this time searching for every Thomas listed and cross-referencing their occupations and addresses. One entry caught her attention: Thomas Miller, private detective, office at 245 Main Street. The address was just 3 blocks from Mrs. Patterson's bakery, where Margaret had discovered that Elizabeth was secretly living. Sarah's research into private detectives in Hartford in 1903 revealed a fascinating and often murky profession. Private investigators of that era frequently worked on behalf of wealthy families, sometimes to resolve scandals discreetly or to track down individuals who had information that was valuable to their clients. At the Hartford History Museum, Sarah found a collection of business cards and advertisements from the period. Thomas Miller's card was preserved in a display about early 20th century professions: Thomas Miller, discreet investigations, recovery of missing persons and valuable items, confidential consultations available. The museum curator, James Walsh, had extensive knowledge about Hartford's business community from that era. Private detectives in 1903 operated in a gray area, he explained. Some were legitimate professionals who helped families find lost relatives or investigate fraud. Others were essentially hired thugs who worked for whoever paid them. What kind of cases might have involved a young woman like Elizabeth? Sarah asked. Dr. Walsh considered her question carefully. Wealthy families sometimes hired investigators to retrieve wayward daughters or to recover stolen property or documents. There were also cases involving blackmail. Investigators might be hired either to prevent it or to facilitate it. Sarah's stomach tightened. Could Elizabeth have been a target rather than a willing bride? The evidence was beginning to suggest that the wedding portrait wasn't documenting a marriage at all, but rather some kind of coercive situation. Her research into Thomas Miller revealed more disturbing details. A Hartford Courant article from September 1903 reported his death in what was described as a tragic accident at the railroad yards. The brief article mentioned that Miller had been investigating a case involving missing documents when he allegedly fell from a moving freight car. The timing was suspicious, just 2 months after Elizabeth's disappearance. Sarah was beginning to suspect that both Elizabeth and Thomas had become victims of something far more dangerous than a simple missing person case. Sarah's investigation had reached a critical juncture. She needed to understand what Elizabeth might have known or possessed that would put her in such danger. Margaret's diary mentioned that Elizabeth had discovered she was looking for any events that might have required the services of a private detective and could have inadvertently involved Elizabeth. Her persistence paid off when she discovered a series of articles about a major embezzlement scandal at Hartford National Bank in May 1903. Approximately $50,000 had vanished from the bank's accounts, an enormous sum that would be equivalent to over $1.5 million today. The bank's president, William Thornton, had hired private investigators to recover the missing funds and identify the thief. One of the investigators mentioned in the coverage was Thomas Miller. Sarah's pulse quickened as she pieced together the timeline. The embezzlement was discovered in early May. Thomas was hired to investigate. Elizabeth's diary entries suggested that she met Thomas in late May or early June. Their wedding portrait was dated June 15th. Elizabeth disappeared in July, and Thomas died in September. But who is Elizabeth in all of this? Sarah returned to Margaret's diary, reading more carefully for any clues about Elizabeth's employment or social connections. She found her answer in an entry from the spring of 1903. Elizabeth has secured a position as a secretary at Hartford National Bank. She is quite excited about the opportunity, as it pays well, and the work is respectable for a young woman. Sarah's heart raced. Elizabeth worked at the bank where the money was stolen. She likely had access to records, transactions, and information that could identify the real thief. If she had discovered something that contradicted Thomas's investigation, or worse, if she had evidence that Thomas himself was involved in the embezzlement, her life would indeed have been in serious danger. The wedding portrait began to make perfect sense. Thomas had used a fake marriage ceremony to gain Elizabeth's trust, and Elizabeth, realizing that she was in danger, had used the portrait session to document evidence of her situation, her forced smile hiding fear, her hand signal calling for help, and her note to be discovered later as proof of what had really happened. Sarah knew that she needed to find official records of the embezzlement investigation to confirm her theory. The Hartford Public Library's newspaper archives contained extensive coverage of the bank scandal, including details about the investigation's progress through the summer of 1903. A breakthrough article from August 1903 revealed that the investigation had taken an unexpected turn. The missing $50,000 had been traced to a series of forged documents and falsified transactions. But the evidence pointed not to a bank employee, but to someone with intimate knowledge of the bank's procedures and access to official documentation. The article quoted Bank President Thornton. "We have discovered that our investigation was compromised from within. The individual we trusted to find the thief appears to have been the perpetrator himself, using his position to cover his tracks while continuing to steal from our institution." Sarah's theory was correct. Thomas Miller hadn't been investigating the embezzlement. He had been committing it, using his role as a private detective to gain access to bank records and forge the documents that were needed to steal the money. But Elizabeth had figured it out. As a bank secretary, she would have had access to the original records and could have spotted the discrepancies between Thomas's reports and the actual transaction documents. The final piece of the puzzle came from a September 1903 police report that Sarah found in the City Hall archives after Thomas Miller's death at the railroad yards. Police had searched his office and living quarters. They discovered $30,000. A police note attached to the report provided the chilling final detail. Evidence suggests that Miller forced Miss Hayes to sign documents authenticating his fraudulent transactions. Her disappearance likely occurred when she threatened to expose his scheme. Miller's death appears to be suicide rather than accident, possibly to avoid arrest and prosecution. Sarah leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the tragic story that she had uncovered. Elizabeth hadn't been Thomas's willing bride. She had been his victim, coerced into helping with his embezzlement scheme, and then eliminated when she became a threat. The wedding portrait wasn't a celebration. It was Elizabeth's desperate attempt to leave evidence of her situation, knowing that Thomas intended to silence her permanently. Sarah's investigation had revealed a tragic story of courage and victimization that had been buried for over 120 years. Elizabeth's cleverly hidden messages in the wedding portrait, her brave smile that was masking terror, her secret hand signal that was calling for help, and her note that was pointing toward the truth, had finally been understood. But Sarah's work wasn't finished. She felt a deep responsibility to ensure that Elizabeth's story was told and her bravery was recognized. She prepared a comprehensive report that documented her findings and contacted the Hartford Courant, hoping that they would publish Elizabeth's story as a historical feature. The newspaper's editor, Maria Rodriguez, was fascinated by the investigation. "This is exactly the kind of historical mystery that our readers love," she said. "But more importantly, it's a story about a woman who showed incredible courage in impossible circumstances." Sarah also reached out to genealogy websites, hoping to locate any living descendants of the Hayes family who might want to know about Elizabeth's fate. Her search led to Patricia Hayes, a great-great-niece who was living in Boston and had always wondered about the family stories of an ancestor who had disappeared mysteriously in Hartford. "We always heard whispers about Aunt Elizabeth," Patricia said during their phone conversation. "My great-grandmother used to say that Elizabeth had tried to help catch a bad man, but got in trouble for it. I never knew if it was true." Patricia traveled to Hartford to see the portrait and learn about her ancestor's story. Standing in the Historical Society and looking at Elizabeth's photograph with new understanding, she wiped away tears. "She was so young," Patricia whispered. "But she was trying to do the right thing, even when it put her in danger." Sarah arranged for the portrait to be properly preserved and displayed at the Hartford History Museum with a plaque that told Elizabeth's complete story. The exhibit would ensure that visitors understood both the historical context of early 20th century banking fraud and the personal courage of one young woman who refused to remain silent about corruption. Sarah looked at Elizabeth's portrait one final time before it was moved to the museum. She marveled at how one woman's desperate message, hidden in plain sight for over a century, had finally revealed the truth. Elizabeth's smile, once a mystery, now stood as a testament to her bravery, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary photographs hold the most extraordinary stories, waiting for someone who is willing to look closely enough to see what others had missed. Elizabeth's legacy lived on, her story finally told.